I'm hoping and assuming everyone can hear me online. I'm sure everyone can hear me here today. Look, it's a great honour and a great privilege to present at ASEG AGM. And I do appreciate the offer from Kate today. So what I suggested to Kate was I'd just pass on some reflections and some thoughts about where we're at with geophysics education. I've been involved with it for a long time. So hopefully this will work. Nope, that one.
I think it's because that's popping. There we go.
Lovely. Look, I reflect back on my path into geophysics, and I've come through a very traditional path. At school, I was involved with STEM subjects, maths and physics particularly. And I did geology as a sort of hobby, I guess, with family. So my entree into geophysics was that I like physics and maths, but I also like going out and digging holes. So geophysics was suggested to me, and I went from school into university at Edinburgh. I did mostly a physics degree with a geophysics major. And then I moved into what's been a wonderful career for me. But I suspect a lot of people in geophysics across Australia followed similar paths, from a school background in the sciences to a university course which have specialized in geophysics into the careers that we all enjoy today. And I've put at the top here as sort of there's a supply and a demand. And of course, the demand is from industry, from government, and the supply is from school. And we always assume that the jobs that are created and the career prospects from industry and elsewhere are matched by the desire from the school cohort. So that's my sort of supply and demand sort of paradigm. So what I'm going to do is sort of break that paradigm down into a sort of different sectors and talk initially about demand for geophysicists. So who wants geophysics? I grabbed a whole lot of stuff off the web recently, and I've been sort of looking and trying to work out who wants geophysicists at the moment. Hopefully we're all wanted by our companies, by our organizations, but I just took this from Seek. So this was a sort of profile of the kind of jobs that geophysicists are being advertised for at the moment. There are 23 job opportunities present on Seek at the moment, which is an enormous number. There's predicted job growth of 5.4% in the next 5 years. I have no idea where that figure comes from, but it's one of those sort of numbers that sound good. It's other areas say job growth, moderate job growth, and it's obviously linked to the resources sector. Salaries are good. The job satisfaction was only based on 2 reviews, so there was like TripAdvisor, you can take it or leave it, depending on whether somebody loved or hated their work. So maybe we should all jump on Seek and tell us what they think and give us a different job satisfaction. But clearly there's a demand. The other set of figures were from government website, basically profiling different industries and saying essentially what people did in those industries, roughly how many hours they worked, how many people were involved. Some interesting statistics there. The average age is 42, 20% female. So we are still very much unbalanced in our gender distribution. 44 hours, which fantastically was about 6 hours less than geologists claim to do each week. So maybe somebody's not telling the truth, but and there's about 1,100 people across the country, and the census data basically said they were geophysicists by trade. Now, there's obviously a lot more people involved in geophysics than that. Anyone who's doing geology and exploration, petroleum, minerals will use geophysics, but 1,100 people identified as being geophysics orientated, and they So essentially, if you take a 30-year career, that means we need about 30 new geophysicists each year going into industry, or government, sorry, I should say. Okay, so these are some slightly older statistics. I couldn't find anything much newer, but much of that growth was in WA. So 30% improvement, I guess, in the number of job adverts in the last few years. Queensland, a little bit behind that. We're in the smaller groups at the top, but South Australia at least is sort of on the board there. But the point about this was there was a demand for geophysicists from industry and from government. The other little sort of reflection on sort of the demand was that the range of skills were varying as well, that what was required was students with more sort of data presentation, data literacy skills, ability to program, sort of the STEM type activities that we hear a lot about. So there's a whole bunch of statistics on this slide, but really the thing which I was just going to raise was that students and people moving into industry who could program, who were literate in data, for example, had abilities to problem solve and were critical thinkers, earned more money and had more job opportunities. So there was a demand for higher technical skills than perhaps there has been in the past. So these type of skills people call enterprise skills. They involve various things. There's a few of those there: problem solving, communication skills, digital literacy, and so on. So what it says is that basically when I went through university, I sort of went through a straight path of going into a degree. I learned sort of Maxwell's equations and Newton's laws and all the basic science things. But many of the skills we require now involve other things, the ability to be able to communicate, ability to critical thinking and problem solving. So these are enterprise skills. So look, what I was trying to establish there was that there's actually a big demand. We see it that there's good jobs, there's good career opportunities, there's interesting work. So surely there must be a supply of students coming into this market. Surely there must be a drive that people are saying, these are good careers. Why don't we get people involved in this? So who and where are the next generation coming from? Well, I looked into this a little bit further, and it makes quite,
Carry on.
Okay, sorry.
I'm just going to move that.
It makes quite sort of, I guess, the picture coming out of the sector is quite gloomy. It starts at very early levels in year 4s to 8s. This was a nice graphic that came out of the conversation. It's one of those generic kind of graphics. I'm not quite sure how the data are actually sourced, but essentially what it says is that the number of students who have low mathematical skills or almost no mathematical skills increases from year 4 to year 8, and those with more advanced critical mathematical skills decline from year 4 to year 8. Now that decline is even more pronounced between genders, so girls drop out of maths much more readily than boys do. My daughter has just started year 8 at high school. She's in a STEM stream. She's one of 5 girls out of 23, there are 23 boys. So there's already this very large divide between girls and boys at year 8. So we can see this from year 4 to year 8, there's a decline in the sort of mathematical kind of desire and knowledge and able to sort of critically solve problems. And of course, when we get to year 12, that accentuates. But if we take another step towards a different metric, this is called PISA, which is Programme for International Student Assessment. It's organized by the OECD, and it's held every 3 years. So the last one was in 2018, so there'll be one this year in 2021. and it tests 15-year-olds on their performance in 3 areas: maths, science, and reading. And it particularly, where it's focusing on, it's not just the ability to know how to deal with numbers or how to write down science equations, but what you can do with that. So it's a little bit more, not just knowledge, but also being able to understand how that knowledge can be applied. So it's a fantastic, comprehensive, rigorous international assessment, and it goes across about 80 countries across the world. So it's not every country, but it covers a wide range of, I guess, countries, wealthy and poor countries, from different geographical locations. And here's how it goes. We, the right-hand or left-hand figure, these are our scores for maths, science, and reading over from 2009 to 2018, and everything's on a sharp decline. The OECD average is for maths, it's a little bit above 491, I think it's 494. So we are below average for mathematical skills across the OECD. We're just above the average, which is about 500 for science and reading. But we've still got 2021 data will come out this year, and if that trend continues, then we will go below the OECD average. And it's interesting to reflect that the big investment in education, which came about in the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, was about $800 million was spent on science, STEM centres and science learning, and also language learning centres across schools across Australia. And that was 11 years ago now, and there's very little evidence that that's made a major kind of impact in that sector.
Well, it has, they've all declined.
Exactly. Or maybe it would have got worse if we hadn't had them, so who knows. What I've got in the 3 little graphs, which you might just be able to see in the room, hopefully online, is these are figures which show the variations from the early 2000s from these PISA scores up to the most recent one. And the top orange one is the science, is the reading literacy, purple is mathematics, and the green is science. And what it's got as the 2 bars are the darker grey ones are the percentage of students who are at the higher performing end of this PISA scale, and the lighter grey bars are for the lower end of the scale. So the takeaway message from these is in the early rounds of these schemes in the early 2000s, there were more students in the higher end than in the lower end. And in 2018, there are almost twice as many students in the low end as in the high end. So there's been an enormous shift in the distribution of students into the sort of lower performing parts of this grouping. If you take the same data for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds and Indigenous students, the numbers in those black columns are about 2 and 3 for most years. Yep, sorry.
What's got anything to do with the actual reduction in the entrance requirements into university and for a larger cohort going in?
It's very multiple number of factors. That could be one of them. Whether the universities demand those requirements and then students match those. But I think we've seen the same decline occur across many Western countries. So I think it's probably more systematic than it is sort of particularly one mechanism. But just a little bit more delving into those data, you can take those numbers from the various schemes from reading, mathematics, and science, and you can compare them against Singapore, which is the top ranking country in all 3 of those discipline areas, and you can translate that into the sort of the age difference in terms of their abilities. So in terms of reading, Singapore students are effectively 1.3 years older than the equivalent age students in Australia, or they have 1.3 more years of reading ability. In terms of mathematics, it's 3 years difference. So in other words, a student in Singapore has effectively 3 more years ability than a similar age student in Australia. So fairly significant and major impact, I guess, in terms of the number of students coming into the system. Now, it's not the same everywhere across the world. That's just one nice example from Estonia. I knew very little about Estonia. It's got a population of about 1 million, so not much bigger than Adelaide. And their grades have been going up and up and up over the last few years, and they're well above us in all categories now. And they've gone from a baseline which was below us, particularly in reading. Invested heavily in teaching, and invested heavily in educating teachers and paying teachers well relative to the economy of Estonia. But the graph there and the little table just shows the countries with various scores, and the sort of usual suspects of Finland and some of the Scandinavian countries are all high up on those lists, and they're all higher than Australia. So all of those metrics, when you get to year 12, you find that the students really have very few or very little ability in mathematics or desire to take the more rigorous mathematics subjects. So some statistics here. Still a large number of year 12 students do take a maths subject at year 12, but it's the proportion choosing in our state specialist maths has gone down significantly over the last 20 years. There's an interesting aspect about more than 50% of principals said that the teachers who taught the year 12 were basically not qualified for that discipline area. And 22% of Australian year 8 students were taught by out-of-field teachers compared to an international average of 13%. So what we're finding is, of course, students and staff are not fully qualified to teach these subjects. And of course, then the students don't engage. I think all of us could probably name a teacher from our high school that influenced the path that we're on now. I have a geology teacher from my school, Mr. Hughes. He was a little unconventional, but you know, that was 40 odd years ago, and I still remember who he was and what he did, and has a major influence on me. And if you're being taught by a teacher who knows nothing about or very little about the subjects they're teaching, obviously that's going to have an impact, particularly at those critical age groups of, say, year 8 and 9. So I guess the point there is that the supply of students is not there to match the demand from industry. So we want 30 odd students to go into industry each year, or government and industry and research and everything else. Then we need a whole cohort to come in, but that cohort isn't there. Okay, so the third part of the story, though, is the university sector. And I've got the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not a lot of good, so it's more on the downside. Yeah, I'm pretty good at stealing images off the web, but I teach my students about plagiarism and attribution, so I can steal things, but then I can say where I've stolen them from, so that's the main thing. Okay, so anyway, Clint Eastwood is an inspiration for this. You're aware of the university's story over the last few years. Massive increase in the revenue from international students. So you might just be able to make out on this chart, the y-axis is billions of dollars. So The international students were bringing in about $4 billion, and you might just be able to make out 2008, 10, 12, and so on along the bottom. It's a little bit washed out on the screen. So in 2008, there was about $4 billion coming from international students. By 2018, it was close to $10 billion. So that it doubled and a halved over a space of about 10 years. And we saw that across the university sector, just massive increase in the number of students. And I'm sure all of us were aware of it by the massive number of new buildings going up and grand halls and beautiful sort of new adornments to cities across Australia that basically were being built for the international students to bring them to the country, to get them enrolled and so on. The blue line at the top is what we get from domestic students. So clearly that's still the largest component of our income from the universities. So it started around about 10 billion and it ended up at about 13 billion. And we have some assurance from the federal government that that will continue. The places will continue to be funded. So we have a domestic load that's fairly fixed over the next few years, and we won't see a lot of growth in there. The international students, there's a couple of scenarios here. There's a sort of the worst case and probably the best case scenario in terms of the numbers and the amount of income. The worst case is about a loss of $19 billion across the next 3 years. So there's about 38 universities across Australia, so roughly $500 million per university over the next 3 years is lost from international students. The little green square at the bottom is there was an announcement by the federal government to fund additional short course places and sort of graduate diplomas, but that's really a drop in the ocean compared to the loss of income. So all the universities got hit. Some got hit a lot more than others. And of course, we're seeing a lot of tension across the university sector. Now, on my next slide, I've summarized in a very general way the state of play across the universities. I didn't want to put too much detail in here, primarily because it's sort of incomplete data. There's things that are changing very rapidly. But just to summarize here, very few universities are unchanged from last year to this year. And I'm going to say basically there's 2 universities which haven't really changed, or 3 universities perhaps. UWA, Adelaide University, and Australian National University. We've had almost no change in student numbers, in number of courses, in programs. So we were probably less exposed to international students than other universities. Pretty much everywhere east of us has had a big impact, and most universities have had a reduction in numbers of courses. And as the mantra is basically that if your course numbers are less than a certain threshold, which depending on the university might be 15, it might be 50, those courses are no longer viable. So many courses across the university sectors, places like Sydney University, Melbourne University, others have had a reduction in the number of courses, but it's not quite clear where we're going to land with that. Generally speaking, we've got relatively low numbers of geoscience students. It does vary across between different parts of the country. And there are BSc programs which have geophysics somewhere in the title. It could be just straight BSc geophysics, or it could be geology and geophysics, have closed or are closing and are no longer viable. So there's been an enormous change in the geosciences teaching across the university sector across Australia. There's been quite a few voluntary separations and some forced redundancies. There's been ending of contracts, and it will probably take another year or 2 before we've really realized exactly where we're going to end and land with this. But the picture is that it's certainly not all doom and gloom. And some of the universities like Curtin University are looking to restructure their degrees and trying to embed subjects in other courses. But it's never going to be quite the same as it was last year or the year before. So some very significant changes have occurred over the last 6 months. And I suspect we'll still see some more big changes over the next year until we get a good idea of how many international students finally come back to Australia, either physically or enrolled in remotely. Just actually going back to that figure, I think the way we're tracking is not the worst case scenario, which is the lower of those two curves, but the slightly less dented scenario. But that's still a lot of students who are not enrolling in university this year from overseas. And of course, they would normally have been here for 4 years or 3 years. So there will be a big hit to the sector. So look, my final part is we can't leave on a gloomy note. I think there are grounds for optimism. I think we have to be optimistic and see this as an opportunity to think a little bit differently about how geophysics is taught and how we deliver geophysics education. So just going back to one of my first slides, of course, that's the traditional path. You start from school, you go through a set number of years through university, you move into a career, and you might be in that career for some years, you might move around a little bit, but you kind of made that step from the tertiary sector into a working environment. So that's a traditional pathway, and of course that will still be there, but the pathway in the future may look something like this. So this is a map of the London Underground. What we might find, of course, is that students come in from many different starting points. So it could be at the end of any of these lines. They may come in with different ranges of subjects and different interests, different passions. And where they end up might come up quite different. And they may find that you start off on one path, and then of course you've got to change into another path, pick up different bits of this travel network in the sense, but of course in the university sector, you're going to be perhaps adding in extra courses, retraining. So the education system of the future may look more like this than a single linear narrative from the start to the finish. This is not an original idea for me. This is other people have presented the same concept of trying to think about how convoluted the pathways of the students of the future will be. And rather than seeing it as being a simple 3 years of post-secondary school education. So I think we've certainly learned a lot in the last year by transitioning from classroom-based activities week after week into online activities. Some of these have worked better, some have worked worse, but we've found that some things are actually much better than we were doing. Other things like identifying rock samples, there's no substitute for holding the rock and throwing it up and down. I think what we do have in geophysics is opportunities to spread into different areas. Most of our graduates go into minerals and petroleum. So from our honours students over the last 5 years at the University of Adelaide, just a bit over half of them, so 62 out of 120 went into the minerals sector. About 20 out of that 120 went into research, into PhDs. About 15 were in the petroleum sector, and there was another 15 or so into other somewhat allied but not absolutely geoscience areas, and then there are a few we don't know. But so our focus has largely been in the minerals and petroleum sector, and then in the research sector as well. And I've just thrown up some images here of areas that we may see more engagement from students who might see that they might end up in minerals, or they might end up in petroleum, but they might come to university with a different view. So I've got everything from critical minerals at the top, water. The 7 is Seven Sisters program. It's about finding water on the moon and finding resources on Mars. Archaeology and agriculture, CO2 sequestration. The bottom figure is from DM website for the Gawler Challenge, so data science. And I think there may be opportunities to bring in students who would never absolutely ever identify with the mineral sector or the petroleum sector, but we can encourage them into a fantastic career in some of these areas that perhaps don't even exist at the moment. Certainly, data science, space program, critical minerals have all emerged in the last few years that could be enormously big employers in the future. So my final slide is, there's lots of challenges. So although there's grounds for optimism, and I think we'll have to reimagine the way we teach geophysics, and we may not be able to teach it in a singularly linear version now, but that doesn't come without its challenges. And the first one I've got there is just how do we really connect with primary and secondary education sectors in a strategic manner? Now, I'm a male in my 50s. I'm probably as old as the dinosaurs to most high school kids. And if I go and tell them that geophysics is a wonderful career, they won't believe me, or they'll just think I'm just one of their parents or the parents' generation. We need a way of connecting, but not necessarily to try and connect with everyone across the sector. We can't change in the sort of the way students are taking mathematics. There's still a cohort who like sciences, and there's still opportunities in the STEM area, and there's still students who would like to travel the world and do wonderful things. There must be a way of connecting with them, and we have to think better about how we're marketing. We can't just say we offer wonderful careers in in geophysics. Most students would have no idea what we're talking about. We've got an issue of national disparity in what we can offer across the country. It may end up that a lot of the geophysics teaching is done in Perth, UWA and Curtin in particular, Adelaide, and then little bits here and there. But it means that a student growing up in New South Wales may have very few opportunities to do geophysics. How do we get them to move? Well, it's very difficult. I'm not sure we've necessarily got pathways for enough graduates. And if we're trying to ensure we have, say, roughly a 30 student output each year, that's going to be a challenge. And I've got extending geophysics beyond minerals and petroleum exploration. I think that the image a lot of students have of the resources sector are the adverts they see on the TV or elsewhere for BHP or whoever, and with people in high vis, in remote mine sites. It's part of the industry, but it may not appeal to a year 8 or 9 student. And the last one I've got is just thinking about how do we change our model of education from that sort of linear progression, you do the university, then you go out and you get your job, into a sort of pathway where people are coming and going all the time, perhaps. So we don't want to put everything into an online forum. We love the face-to-face. We love that opportunity to be able to work with everybody. But we have to also be, I guess, to recognize that not everybody can sit in a classroom all the time and sit there for 12 weeks, 2 hours a week for these courses we run. We may have to be quite creative about how we run them as short courses, intensive courses, out of hours courses, and all sorts. I think there's loads of opportunities. We're at a sort of a major change in the education sector. And I think there's grounds to be very optimistic, but it will take some time. And if anyone's got some thoughts on any of those challenges, I'd love to hear them. So with that, thank you very much. I do appreciate being asked to give this talk tonight, and I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. That was great. Lots to think about, and yeah, lots to think about the way the ASEG can help to achieve some of these goals and ideas too. So do we have any questions? I might take in-person questions and I'll repeat them through the microphone, and then we'll take any if there's any online, and maybe Alison can read them out when we get to it. So in person, we've got a question from Matt.
I have a comment about a factor that was introduced into society in around 2008. They've become more and more prevalent since then. Smartphones and social media.
Yeah, that's a good one, Matt. We're often surprised at how technologically illiterate students are when they come to university. And yet the paradigm is, of course, they're the tech generation. But Facebook is just a point and click, as most social media, and is really low level. So the idea of technology, although everyone's very, very comfortable with technology, most of our students who've come through can barely work Excel when they first come to uni. And it's quite daunting at first.
I still can't. I haven't ever used Word or Excel in my whole life.
It's look, it's you know, there will be people who learn Python, and there will be people who learn R, and there will be people who will write software from scratch, and the people who use software. But I guess it's that literacy in the sense of being comfortable enough to understand what's going on a little bit behind the chassis of whatever you're driving. And at the moment, you know, a smartphone is so clever that you hardly have to know anything about it. Yep. Yep.
What I like on board with and I have Indiana Heinson. That did wonders for archaeology.
Are
you repeating the question?
I think Danny was suggesting that Graham should be the new Indiana Jones for geophysics. Answer that.
No, but there is an image problem with the geosciences and the resources sector in general. We noticed in 2010, or really, I guess from about 2005 or 6 onwards, when the boom started, there was a flood of students in, and we really didn't have to do anything. We had over 100 students in our 3rd year courses, and we hardly be able to teach any of them. We've actually got down to a much more sustainable number, about 30, which seems to be okay at our university, which is fine. But what we haven't seen in the now that we're getting a bit more of a sort of boom in minerals in WA, we haven't seen an uptake in here. We've seen pretty much level. Western Australian universities have seen a small increase, but not huge. So I think there's a change in the student body. And I think the mantra is that the resources sector is destructive and is not responsible. And there are examples where that is the case. So we do have an image problem. I'm not sure quite how to address that. Maybe we do need a... Yeah. But no, I think sometimes some of these other sectors, I mean, the critical mineral sector, for example, I mean, I've had students in my office say, I don't want to look for gold or copper, but I'm quite happy to look for lithium and cobalt. Well, they might be surprised in their life that they actually end up looking for all of the things at the same time. And over time, of course, perhaps their views change. But certainly coming into university, they're quite, you know, idealistic about, they like the idea of some things and not other things. Certainly in the petroleum sector, I think they're more hard hit than the mineral sector. Petroleum numbers are very low at the moment.
I
Yeah.
some 40 years ago at an APIA conference, one of the presenters said, and these people, geophysicists, by the time they reach 45 to 50, they've been promoted into management and their skills are lost to the industry. Do you actually spend any time actually teaching anything about management to students going through geophysics? And secondly,
can I just repeat that bit before I forget? Sure. So the first part of the question was, by the time geophysicists get to 40 or 50 years old, they're generally in management. And so the question was, do we spend any time teaching in management skills? And then hold on for part two.
Part two is, given what's happening in Lot 14 with the space industry now, and since I retired, I got deeply involved in climate science and have been to quite a few of the AGU annual fall meetings. And given what's on display there in terms of the space industry, it's utterly stunning. And I would have thought a significant focus on something like that would actually, given what's happening in Lot 14, would actually be a serious interest for the university, especially Adelaide.
And the second part was there's been a lot of visibility of space science at AGU and conferences, and that could be something that the universities could look to focus on more, but worded much more elegantly. So over to you, Graham.
I'm sure it will.
Oh, look, two great questions. To answer your first question, no, we don't really teach management theory, management strategies. Part of it, I guess, is we're teaching 20-year-olds, and the management time of their life is perhaps 20 years in the future, and the world is different. So it's probably something we would struggle with, and also as staff ourselves. I mean, we're another generation different, and so we don't necessarily understand what are the management principles. So
I just say, my experience is I actually went into management when I was 30. So it was a very short period of actually professional equivalent in physics before going into management. And it might be useful to actually point this out to the students. This is a probable pathway.
Yeah. And I suspect that the path is the same in many industries. If you're a civil engineer or an agricultural scientist, I guess that really comes into that engagement in lifelong learning, short courses, is that I think perhaps one of the things we have to consider is that the university model of a 3-year degree or 4 years with honours, or maybe a little bit extra with a master's or a PhD, and that's our sort of start point and the end point with the engagement, is a very old model. I mean, it's been around hundreds of years. And I'm looking at things like data science, for example, and all the developments in data analytics in the last, say, 5 years, and think, well, I never learned any of that when I was at university, and if I was working for a major company, I might need to learn a little bit more about it. So is there opportunities for us to be nimble and fit in with those areas? On your second question about space science, I could not agree more. I think this is an area that is hugely exciting, and I think is coming at us at an enormous rate. And I suspect for most people in Australia, they have very little realization of how quick these programs are going to come. There's literally going to be moon shots and landings in the next 5 years, and then there'll be the first sort of stages of more Mars exploration taking place, and then we've got to look for water on the moon and then resources on Mars to build things from 3D printers and so on. And for students at high school now, it is a brilliant opportunity. And I think part of our mantra is to how do we get to those students? How do we tell them that there are going to be careers of the future that don't exist at the moment? Now, we see this a little bit at the University of Adelaide. We have a astrophysics and space science degree, and it's been run for probably 10 years. Typically got 5 to 10 students per year. When the Space Centre was announced for Adelaide, those numbers went from 10 to 50 because everyone went, whoa, it's actually happening. And it's not a, something you would sort of just fall into if you're just a space, like a physics person. Now that degree is probably mostly focused on the big physics of the universe. So what are black holes and the formation of the universe. But there really is a great opportunity, which we're pushing hard for at the moment, to say the big opportunity for those students, the big science is wonderful, they should do it. It's an opportunity to do it. But in the long run, the jobs you're going to get might be designing seismometers for Mars, or processing heat flow data from the moon, or doing some kind of spectral sensors for exploration. And at the same time, that same technology can be used on Earth as well. So all that kind of remote sensed technology and deployment from rovers and so on, no reason why it can't be done here as well. So great opportunities. And I think we are certainly seeing an engagement with students, but it's just, we're just starting on that path at the moment.
Just one final example. The data acquisition systems and recording systems we used in the 1970s in the oil industry came out of the Apollo program. It's been going on for a long time. It's transferred from the very high tech and the more mundane, let's say.
Yeah.